then they're sort of overlaying it with what's going on in the ring. Haven't seen that too many times. And we're seeing Hogan crowned the WCW champion in his first match in WCW as well. And like I say, I think for the purest WCW fan, you'd be sitting at home pretty, I'd imagine, not so happy. We're seeing this, just a guy come in and win it.
Well, this is it, and it's very reminiscent to WrestleMania 9 and what happened there. But I mean, WWF were going for a big youth movement at that time, so they were probably happy with the direction they were taking. Business was down though, so they probably would have thought, well, we wouldn't mind Hogan coming in and giving us a buy rate like that. But you know, things did turn around once Austin got there, and things turned around 96, 97, and the Attitude Era kicked in. But they had, I mean, from this point, business in WWF was way down, and the youth movement, as much as they were trying to push the younger stars like the Undertakers, Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, etc., business wasn't quite doing it, and they were still pumping out the really, you know, rubbish gimmicks like Jean-Pierre Lafitte and you know, and all that stuff. And don't get me wrong, I thought Jean-Pierre Lafitte was all right, but you know, it's just an example of the characters they were pumping out just wasn't clicking with the audience. But it was the building process with WWF at the time. But a lot of purists were thinking, well, WCW have taken a bit of a shortcut here, and you know, and things only got worse, in my opinion, for WCW at the time. Before the NWA was created, you know, you had people like, you know, John Tenter coming as the Shark. You had Giant Haystacks coming as Loch Ness. You had, you know, Paul White coming as the Giant, and it got all a little bit too cartoonish. You had Brutus Beefcake as Zodiac, and they had all these weird World War III matches and the big, what was it, Cage of Doom, or that triple layered cage. It got really, really poor, and this was the start of all of that. So I think traditional WCW fans were a little bit put off by this. You did have kind of, you know, glimmers of hope. You know, a couple of years after this, you obviously had the cruiserweight division that really kind of come into its own with the Rey Mysterios and the Eddie Guerreros and all that. And things obviously massively turned a corner when the NWO came on the scene, and things really kind of, like I say, the heel turn for Hogan, and things really turned a much brighter. It was much more reality based instead of getting away from the Mickey Mouse cartoon stuff. And then both federations, WCW and WWF, were really, really kind of kicking into fifth gear around that time. But you know,
I love
see,
the
brain is not happy. Don't talk to me.
It's like he's gone into depression. I love that selling there that he's doing.
It was an okay match. I wouldn't put it above the MSG match, to be honest with you.
No.
But they
less
probably
is more,
had to.
I think.
Yeah, I think they probably had to put together a longer match that felt bigger, you know, for the bigger scale. And like I say, this potentially might have been the match that we got at WrestleMania.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. I wanted to include that in this episode just so that, you know, our listeners could literally see what would happen if it was on a pay-per-view. But obviously, like I've been saying through it, I don't think the magic was quite there for me at this time. And obviously, Hogan would go on. Like you say, I don't think it was necessarily a great time in WCW, but it wasn't a great time business-wise in WWF either. Many of my listeners that would have gone through some of the watch-along series that I've been doing on In Your House would definitely know what I'm talking about, because again, sets the you know, weren't quite as they once were. It was downplayed a little bit through 97 and stuff like that. And you know, when Hogan switched, it was almost like perfect timing again, because if you think about it, a lot of the kids that would have bought all of his merchandise, like you and I, even for once of a better thinking, but once he turned heel, it was almost like all those fans were now teenagers or adults just going into that, and now they're like, hang on a minute, screw you, I've been a fan of yours all this time, now you're telling me this. And so it worked really, really well on the generation cycle, because those, and then it got edgy, and again, those fans were a little bit older, they could relate to it better. Which, you know, is obviously what happens. I mean, it's what people used to say about John Cena. They said, you know, maybe the first 10 years is going to be like Hogan, where all these fans are then going to be a little bit more edgy and teenagers. That's when he'll turn heel. We never got to see that, obviously, but that would have been another sort of circle, if you will, in that part. Overall, we know we got these two many a times in WCW. There were some real stinkers in there that even Rick and Hogan admit themselves, especially.
I think this was as good as it got between those two in WCW. This was as good as it got.
I agree. Obviously, later down the line, I mentioned they did both come back at WrestleMania 18. And you know what? The magic was certainly there, especially Hulkamania. But like I mentioned, it was almost like those fans, they've grown up. The adults going to Canada that year to watch Toronto Sky Dome, you know, even though The Rock was the baby face, the WWF guy, the cool guy even, someone like Hogan, those fans, they'd grown up on this guy. They'd seen him against the Warrior that many years ago, so like 12 years ago up until that point. And so it was a different, almost full circle kind of stuff. And obviously,
shall I say my thoughts on that, John? Just my quick thoughts on that is I feel that The Rock in 2002, when he faced Hogan, was in a very similar holding pattern to what Hogan was 10 years earlier, whereas the fans were kind of getting a bit cool on The Rock and know that he was kind of going out doing the Hollywood stuff. And when Hogan came in at around that time, he was fresh again. He was brand new again to the audience. So it was kind of almost the reverse of what happened to Hogan 10 years earlier, where he was feeling a bit stale and on his way out. This time, Hogan was feeling fresh. The Rock was feeling a bit stale. They were able to put on a brilliant match, and the fans were a big part of that. But that was a historic match. But yeah, I think that The Rock was feeling a little very similar to how Hogan was 10 years earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. And Hogan and Flair, they did have a match, as I said. It was quite a good match actually on Raw. I recommend anybody that wants to go and watch that match. It was in 2002. They did like quite a big match when Hogan obviously had won the Undisputed Championship at the time against Triple H. He went on and had a match with Flair, which was pretty decent. And obviously they had a run in TNA. They, tried to get as much out of it as they possibly could. I think there is always going to be that thing. The one thing coming out of all of this, I think, as a summary, is that Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan have almost been in parallel competition with one another, but from completely different ends of the spectrum. And most times, if you're a purist, if you're a wrestling fan, you're always going to jump with Ric Flair. And I think if you look at it from the nostalgia, the business side of things, maybe the name is Hulk Hogan, I think. What do you think the legacy would have been had we have? I mean, just playing again, if we had have got to see Flair and Hogan, like we mentioned earlier, would it have gone down as a match that we go back to? Like, because some matches, they like now, when they talk about WrestleMania classics, they kind of almost go on the names as opposed to the match, just because, look at those names, like where the Undertaker's come from now, and you go back and there's some matches in there, you look at the names, you think, well, that I forgot about that. But then you watch it, and again, they're at different levels, where they are in their career at the time. But it's hard to know. But do you think people would have gone back, say if we'd have got the MSG style match, do you think that would have been one of the most classical, iconic, like what Vince wanted to get to in terms of having those big, massive names, like where we've seen Rock and Hogan, Cena and Rock, those kind of big established names? Would that have been one of the classic sort of fantasy matches that we could have had possibly, or do you think that it would have got misplaced and we would have looked past it as just another WrestleMania main event?
Do you know what? I think had we have got the MSG style match as a main event of WrestleMania 8, I think we would still be talking about that match as a classic WrestleMania match to this day. But I know for a fact that we would have got the Bash at the Beach style match at WrestleMania 8 instead, because being a WrestleMania, they want to overproduce it. They want to throw in a little bit extra here and a little bit extra there. I think it would have been overproduced. It would have gone longer. I mean, the MSG match went about 12 minutes. This match went more than twice as long, 25, 26 minutes. So I think we would have got a longer, more overly produced, overly booked match, which would have felt a lot more similar to the Bash at the Beach match. And I think that we'd be looking back on that type of match a lot less fondly. So ultimately, I think because of that, I think Vince McMahon made the right decision.
Very interesting there. To a point, I kind of, as much as I don't want to believe it, I kind of have to agree as well to some degree, because I don't know. I do feel maybe it was the Madison Square Garden thing. Maybe, WrestleMania 10 would have been the ideal destination, if any, for that. But regardless, I think that, well, the legacy coming out of it, had it have been, I think they're almost, let's just say they didn't have those two big MSG house show matches. Are they almost a failure to happen because they happened already? I don't know. Where if it had been totally fresh at WrestleMania, I kind of feel like that is the only way it would have ever worked, would have been doing it that way, completely fresh. And if we'd have seen that style, I'm guessing even the people reading all the dirt sheets, they would have been intrigued on this, because it would have been the first one. You wouldn't have heard about it and stuff like that. So, and I think obviously Vince McMahon would have had no doubts in his mind creeping either, that it couldn't work. But it was fascinating to go back to again. And like I say, this is a subject that I don't know why, but I've always been fascinated to thinking about it, talking about it with people like yourself, John. It's been really good to get your take on it as well and share each other's point of views. I'm kind of like, I feel a little bit happier that I'm not the only one that has had this kind of, because I'm like, am I getting obsessed with this stuff?
No.
It's only one match. It is only Flair and Hogan, and it is a long time ago now. I mean, it's an incredible long time, but it's one of those times that I just think, like, we know Goldberg and Austin couldn't happen. They were on completely different shows, different promotions. Sting and Undertaker, very similar, and even if those matches do happen, it's not at the right time. It should, let's face it. And we have had some matches happen. We have had some special matches happen, but like Sting and Triple H, that was way too late for me. Things like that. But I just felt, you'll never get that golden opportunity of really having greatest heel, greatest face at the time, Mr. WCW versus Mr. WWF at the time, on the biggest granddaddy of them all, WrestleMania. And it honestly seemed like the stars of the line, a bit like The Rock and Austin, that magic. To have two big characters like that in the same era, like Shawn and Brett, for instance, that chemistry, it's very golden. Once you get it, that's it. You've got to pounce on it a bit. And I guess I feel like I've been snatched away from the opportunity of ever seeing it. But I think it goes to show there's been so many articles, so much written about this, so much talked about it, that how much this meant to a lot of people, John, obviously, after all this. Well, overall concluding, I know you pretty much have done, as an end point to this episode, out of the matches we saw, was there anything in there that surprised you coming out of this? Because I'm fascinated, because that was the first time we saw the MSG match, for instance, and it seems like it surprised you on the chemistry that they possibly could have.
And when I was watching that and really enjoying it, and you could tell the place had a great feel about it, a great atmosphere about it. And when you were watching it, you're kind of thinking, well, why didn't they go through with the WrestleMania 8 match?
Yeah.
Because it's obviously testament to what we're watching in front of us from Madison Square Garden that it will work. Mm-hmm. But then obviously they had that match again. They had a repeat match in December. They had other matches on the house show loop, and I think that something was quite unique about that match in MSG, and I think it was because it was in MSG. You had the New York fans, you had the New York crowd, you had that New York atmosphere, and you weren't getting that wherever else they wrestled around the country, and you wouldn't have got that same raucous atmosphere in the Hoosier Dome for WrestleMania 8. And I think Vince McMahon kind of realised that it wasn't clicking with everybody and all of the venues and all the markets they were travelling to and putting this house show match. And that's why Vince McMahon does this. He kind of he has a WrestleMania match in mind, and it's not just with Flair and Hogan. And we've got to try it on the house show circuit. We've got to get these two to find a good working pattern together, a good chemistry to see what they do, what they are like in the ring, whether they click. And yes,